All right, welcome to a deep dive into some fascinating stuff, really fascinating stuff about why some nations are rich and some are poor.
This is going to be interesting.
Yeah, we're talking Thomas Sowell, wealth, poverty, and politics. You're interested in all the forces behind economic disparities around the world
Yeah.
throughout history, and so
Yeah,
he really digs into it.
he does.
Geography, culture, politics, the whole shebang.
Yeah.
So
It's a really comprehensive look.
get ready for some surprises.
Yeah.
Like, did you know Amsterdam was built on herring?
That's a fascinating one.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Or how about this? The U.S.
Yeah.
gets more tornadoes than anywhere else combined,
Yeah.
but it's not the richest country.
Yeah.
What's up with that?
Well, and that's exactly the kind of thing that Sowell gets into.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, he's urging us to be really careful about the language that we use and the statistics that we throw around.
Okay.
He argues that terms like the top 1% are often misunderstood,
Okay.
and that these, economic disparities aren't some new phenomenon.
Yeah, he uses some really great examples to illustrate this point, right? Like comparing modern Switzerland, which is 3 times richer than Albania,
Exactly.
or Japan, which
Yeah.
has 9 times the per capita GDP of India.
Yeah, he's highlighting that discussions about wealth and poverty
Right.
are very often framed in a way that ignores the historical context
Oh,
and all these complex factors
okay.
that actually contribute to these disparities.
Okay, so he's not saying that inequality doesn't exist, but we need to be more nuanced in how we think about it.
Exactly.
He's really pushing us to look beyond the simplistic explanations
Yes.
and dig into the evidence.
Exactly. And one of the first things that he tackles is this whole idea of geographic determinism.
Oh, yeah.
This notion that,
Where you are
where you're born.
dictates your economic fate.
Yeah, he argues that geography matters,
Sure.
but it's not destiny.
Like the tornado example.
Yeah.
More tornadoes here
Right.
doesn't mean we're the wealthiest.
Yeah, exactly.
So if it's not geography, then what is it?
Well, he starts talking about the importance of navigable rivers
Okay.
and deep water ports,
Right.
which have been crucial for trade, which in turn,
Leads to.
leads to the exchange of ideas, innovations.
Yeah, right.
He contrasts Western Europe
Okay.
with its easily navigable rivers
Yeah.
that flow into open seas, with Eastern Europe and parts of Africa
Okay.
where rivers are frozen for parts of the year or don't lead to,
Good trade routes.
good trading routes.
It's fascinating to think about how something like the shape of a river
Yeah.
could have such a huge impact
It really can.
on a region's development.
Yeah.
Limited trade equals smaller cultural universe.
Yeah.
Fewer opportunities for progress?
Mm-hmm.
What about natural resources?
He acknowledges the importance of things like arable land.
Oh.
But even there, he emphasizes the human element.
Okay.
He gives the example of people around the Mediterranean
Okay.
who are faced with really poor soil.
Yeah.
So they turn to things like fishing and trade.
Right.
They adapt it to their circumstances.
It's not just about what you have,
Right.
but what you do with it.
Exactly.
So where does culture fit into all this?
Culture, according to Sowell, is absolutely critical.
Okay.
He talks about the Western Hemisphere having similar geography to Europe,
Right.
but vastly different indigenous cultures.
Okay.
And a lot of that comes down to, he points out that the lack of horses or oxen
Oh, wow.
in the Americas limited the size of boats,
Okay.
the scope of trade,
Interesting.
and knowledge exchange.
Crazy how something like not having the right animals could have such a massive ripple effect.
He really does.
Europe and Asia had a leg up because they had the means to connect and exchange ideas across larger distances.
Precisely. And then he goes on to talk about specific cultural values that have contributed to economic success.
Okay.
He argues that the need to survive harsh winters
Right. Right.
in temperate zones
Yeah.
fostered a sense of self-discipline,
Oh,
time management.
Mhm.
That wasn't as necessary in tropical climates where food was available year-round.
Yeah, if you didn't prepare and work hard during that short growing season,
Right?
you wouldn't survive.
Exactly.
But isn't that a bit of a generalization?
Right.
Not everyone in a tropical region lacked discipline.
Exactly. And so emphasizes that he's talking about broad cultural patterns,
Okay.
not individual traits.
Right, of course.
So he's not saying that everybody in one region is the same,
Got it.
but rather that certain cultural values,
Yeah.
shaped by historical experience and environmental pressures,
Right.
can have a huge impact on a society's economic trajectory.
Okay, so let's talk about some of these cultural differences.
Okay.
He brings up the Germans a lot, right?
He does.
What's their secret sauce?
He highlights their impact on various industries, piano-making optics,
Uh-huh.
even military prowess. He points out that American generals like Pershing
Okay.
and Eisenhower
Right.
had German ancestry.
Oh, interesting.
And he attributes a lot of their success to their emphasis on education
Yeah.
and meticulousness,
Yeah.
even when they were a minority in other countries.
I remember him talking about the Germans in Brazil who built schools in the first clearings when pioneering.
Yes,
That's pretty powerful.
it is.
But isn't that kind of a, I don't know, romanticized view of German culture?
Sure, and Sowell doesn't shy away from that.
Right.
He's not presenting any culture as perfect,
Right.
but he's highlighting these specific values
Sure.
that have proven beneficial
Oh.
in terms of economic success.
Yeah.
And he's also careful to point out that cultural borrowing has been hugely beneficial.
That's true.
Where would we be without Arabic numerals, for example?
Good point. Yeah. He also mentions Japan's rapid modernization in the 19th century.
Yeah.
They intentionally adopted Western technology, sent their students abroad to learn. So it sounds like he's saying that being open to new ideas and being willing to adapt
Yes,
is crucial for progress.
absolutely.
But what about cultures that have been isolated?
Well, he acknowledges that isolation can hinder progress.
Okay.
He uses examples like remote mountain villages
Right.
or the limitations faced by sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
Due to its geography, he even talks about Australia's Aboriginal population,
Oh, wow.
who were isolated geographically
Right.
and by the lack of draft animals.
So being cut off from the rest of the world can really limit your opportunities for growth.
Yes.
But he also says that isolation can be a double-edged sword. How so?
Yeah, because it can also protect.
Okay.
He points out that, Britain being an island nation
Yeah.
didn't need a huge standing army like continental Europe,
Right.
which saved them a ton of money and political headaches.
Interesting.
So isolation can cut both ways depending on the circumstances.
So geography isn't destiny,
Right.
but it definitely sets the stage.
It does.
And culture is how people choose to play on that stage.
Yeah.
But what about other obstacles?
He talks about,
What else gets in the way of progress?
he talks about the devastating impact of disease on Native Americans when Europeans arrived.
Right.
It wasn't just conquest.
Right.
European diseases wiped out huge portions of the population who had no immunity.
Right.
He also discusses cultural resistance to change.
Yeah, of course.
Not every society is eager to embrace new ideas.
Right. Change can be scary, challenges, long-held traditions, beliefs.
Yeah.
If geography and culture are so influential, does that mean that governments are powerless to shape economic outcomes?
That's a great question, and it's one that he tackles head on in the next part of the book.
Okay.
He argues that governments can play a powerful role,
Yeah.
but even dictators can't force economic prosperity.
So it's not enough to just have the will to improve things.
No, you need the know-how,
You need the skills,
the skill,
cultural foundation to make it happen.
the human capital.
He uses the example of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward in China.
Yes.
Despite Mao's absolute power,
Right.
it was a catastrophic failure.
It was.
Because it ignored basic economic principles and human realities.
Exactly.
So governments can hinder development just as easily as they can foster it.
Yes.
It sounds like he's skeptical of these top-down approaches that try to engineer outcomes.
Yes.
Without understanding
The complexities.
the interplay of all the factors at play.
Yeah.
But what about social safety nets and welfare programs?
Well, that's where things get really interesting and maybe a bit controversial.
Okay.
He's quite critical of the welfare state,
Okay.
but not for the reasons you might think.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
He argues that it often worsens the very income disparities it aims to reduce.
Wait, how does that work?
Let's delve into that in part 2.
Okay.
We'll unpack his critique of the welfare state and explore how he believes it can actually undermine human capital
Okay.
and create a cycle of dependence.
Sounds like we're about to enter some uncharted territory.
I think we are.
You've definitely piqued my curiosity.
Good.
Can't wait to hear more about this in part 2.
All right.
See you then.
See you then.
Welcome back. You ready to dive deeper into Sowell's critique of the welfare state?
Absolutely. Last time we left off with this idea that the welfare state, while well-intentioned, might actually be making income disparities worse.
Yeah.
That's pretty counterintuitive. How does he explain that?
Well, he argues that by providing a safety net, without simultaneously encouraging self-reliance, it can create a kind of dependency
Yeah.
that disincentivizes people from investing in their own skills and abilities.
Okay, I can see how that could happen.
Yeah.
If your basic needs are met, you might be less motivated to strive for something more.
But doesn't everyone need a little help sometimes? Where do you draw the line between providing support and fostering dependence?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Sowell uses a really fascinating example to illustrate this tension. He compares the free persons of color in America before the Civil War,
Okay.
who, despite immense prejudice, created thriving communities with a really strong focus on education and self-improvement.
Okay.
And he contrasts that with the social decline witnessed in some Black communities after the 1960s, despite increased government assistance.
So on the one hand, you have a group facing incredible adversity, but finding ways to succeed through their own efforts.
Right.
And on the other, you have a group that, despite receiving support, sees a decline in certain areas.
Yeah.
It's a stark contrast.
It is.
What's his point?
He's suggesting that material aid alone isn't enough.
Okay.
There needs to be a cultural shift, a focus on individual responsibility,
Right.
empowerment, alongside economic support.
So it's not just about giving people money.
Exactly.
It's about equipping them with the tools and the mindset. Yes.
To list themselves out of poverty.
Exactly.
But doesn't he risk blaming the victim here? Surely, systemic issues like racism play a role in these disparities, right?
He absolutely acknowledges the historical injustices faced by Black Americans, and he doesn't shy away from discussing the role of discrimination.
Okay.
However, he argues that clinging to a narrative of victimhood can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, preventing individuals from taking ownership of their own destinies.
Okay, so he's not saying that racism doesn't exist or that we shouldn't fight against it,
No.
but he's suggesting that focusing solely on external factors can limit people's agency
Yeah.
and prevent them from recognizing their own potential.
Exactly.
It's a delicate balance.
It is.
And to further illustrate his point, he highlights the success stories of groups like Asian Americans who have faced severe discrimination
Right.
but have still managed to rise economically. He uses these examples, along with those of the Scots, the Japanese, the Lebanese traders we discussed earlier, to show that human capital, resilience, and cultural values prioritizing education,
Yeah.
hard work, and entrepreneurship can overcome tremendous obstacles.
It's interesting that he keeps returning to this idea of human capital.
Yeah,
It seems to be like a central theme in his analysis.
it is.
What about the role of government? If he's skeptical of the welfare state, does that mean he thinks the government should just stay out of it altogether?
Not quite. He delves into this idea that in a free society, the government's role should be to foster a level playing field,
Okay.
not to engineer equal outcomes.
Okay.
He argues that focusing solely on redistributing wealth
Yeah.
can actually disincentivize those at the top from producing more wealth, ultimately harming everyone.
That's an interesting point. I can see how punishing success and rewarding lack of effort
Right.
could ultimately stifle innovation and economic growth.
Exactly.
Do you have an example of what he means?
He uses the example of Igor Sikorsky, the Russian aviation pioneer,
Okay.
who fled to the United States after the communist takeover.
Okay.
America benefited greatly from his inventions, while Russia lost out.
Right.
So he's essentially saying that if you create an environment hostile to success, the talent and innovation will go elsewhere.
So it's not about tearing down those who succeed, but about creating an environment where everyone has the opportunity to succeed.
Yes.
But how do you measure success? Is it all about income brackets?
That's another area where Sowell really challenges conventional thinking.
Okay.
He argues that we need to look beyond these abstract statistics about income brackets,
Okay.
as these categories are constantly shifting, with people moving in and out of them throughout their lives.
So someone could be in the top 1% one year and then drop out the next.
Exactly.
I hadn't thought about it that way.
He cites a study showing that a whopping 70% of Americans reach the top 20% of income earners
Wow.
at some point in their lives.
That's a really powerful statistic. It suggests that there's a lot more social mobility than we might realize.
Yeah.
But he also takes issue with how we define wealth, right? It's not just about income.
Exactly. He criticizes this tendency to conflate income with wealth.
Okay.
Just because someone has a high income in a given year
Yeah.
doesn't mean they're rich in the sense of having accumulated assets.
So someone could make a lot of money in a single year, but still not be financially secure in the long term?
Precisely. He gives the example of an author who spends 10 years writing a book
Right.
and then receives a large lump sum payment upon publication.
Okay.
They might appear rich on paper that year,
Right.
but their financial reality is more complex than that.
Okay, so we need to be careful about the metrics we use and the assumptions we make about wealth and poverty.
Yes.
But even if we agree on how to measure it, is inequality inherently a bad thing? Doesn't it just reflect natural differences in talent and effort?
That's a question that really goes to the heart of Sowell's philosophy.
Yeah.
He challenges this very notion that inequality of outcome is inherently unjust. He argues that we see these vast disparities in almost every human endeavor, from sports to the arts.
Right. Some people are just naturally better at certain things than others.
Exactly. You can't force everyone to be equally good at basketball or playing the piano.
Right.
And he uses a rather provocative analogy to illustrate this point. He points out that tornadoes
Okay.
are not evenly distributed across the globe.
Right.
They're far more common in certain regions.
Yeah.
But we don't demand that they be equally likely to strike everywhere.
Okay, I see what he's getting at. We accept that some things are just randomly distributed,
Right.
even if it seems unfair.
Yeah.
But how does that apply to wealth and poverty? Are you saying that it's all just down to chance?
Not entirely, no. He's not saying that discrimination doesn't exist
Right.
or that we shouldn't strive for a fairer society,
Of course.
but he's cautioning against this assumption that every disparity must be the result of some systemic injustice.
Okay.
He argues that randomness and individual differences in talent, effort, and even luck play a far greater role in outcomes than we often acknowledge.
So while we should work to level the playing field and ensure everyone has a fair shot,
Yes.
we also need to recognize that there will always be differences in outcomes.
Yeah.
And those differences aren't always the result of something sinister or unfair.
Exactly. And he even critiques this very concept of social justice,
Okay.
arguing that it's often used as this vague, undefined term
Yeah.
to justify policies that ultimately concentrate power in the hands of the government,
Right.
rather than empowering individuals.
So he's wary of this idea that the government should be in the business of engineering specific outcomes,
Yes.
even if those outcomes are deemed socially just by some.
Right. He believes that true progress comes not from engineering equal outcomes,
Okay.
but from expanding opportunity
Yeah.
and creating an environment where individuals are free to develop their potential and contribute to a thriving society.
It's a challenging perspective for sure, but it forces us to think beyond these simplistic solutions and grapple with the complexity of these issues.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, some of Sowell's ideas are pretty controversial,
Right.
especially when it comes to his analysis of group differences.
Yeah.
Are we ready to go there?
Let's tackle that head on in part 3.
Okay.
We'll explore his views on group differences, cultural influences, and the potential pitfalls of celebrating authenticity
Okay.
when it comes to economic success.
Wow, I'm a little nervous, but also really curious to hear how he navigates such a sensitive topic.
I think it'll be an interesting conversation.
See you part 3.
See you then.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Thomas Sowell's Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. We've covered a lot of ground. The influence of geography and culture, the complex role of government, and those thought-provoking critiques of the welfare state.
And now, we're getting into what might be the most challenging part of Sowell's analysis.
Yeah.
His exploration of group differences and cultural influences on economic outcomes.
Right. I have to admit, I'm a little apprehensive about this. It's such a sensitive topic, and it's easy to misinterpret or oversimplify his arguments, but I'm also really curious to hear what he has to say and how he navigates these complexities.
Well, remember how he highlights the success of groups like the Germans and the Lebanese?
Uh-huh.
He argues that some of these differences in outcomes can be traced back to cultural values and historical experiences.
Right. He talks about the Germans' emphasis on education and meticulousness, and the Lebanese traders' entrepreneurial spirit.
Right.
But he also looks at groups that have struggled, right? What does he say about those cases?
He suggests that cultural factors can contribute to poverty, just as surely as they can to prosperity.
Okay.
He criticizes the tendency to explain away all disparities solely as the result of external forces like racism or oppression.
Right.
He argues that this can actually discourage individuals from taking responsibility for their own choices and actions.
I can see how some people might accuse him of blaming the victim here.
Right.
But is that really what he's doing?
It's important to remember
Mm.
that Sowell himself comes from a marginalized background. He grew up black in the Jim Crow South
Right.
and experienced firsthand the sting of discrimination.
Okay.
He's not denying the existence of racism or other forms of injustice.
So he's not saying that systemic issues don't matter,
No.
but he's also saying that we can't ignore the role of culture and individual agency.
Right.
It's like he's trying to walk this tightrope between acknowledging the reality of injustice while also empowering individuals to take control of their own destinies.
Exactly. And he brings up the example of black immigrants from the Caribbean,
Oh, yeah.
who often outperform native-born black Americans in education and income,
Okay.
despite facing similar levels of discrimination.
So he's using this example to suggest that cultural factors can sometimes have a greater impact
Yeah.
than external barriers like racism.
Exactly. He also points to the impressive educational achievements of Asian Americans, many of whom came from impoverished backgrounds.
Yeah. Okay.
And he uses these examples to illustrate the power of cultural values that prioritize education, hard work, and delayed gratification.
But what about the argument that these are just stereotypes?
Sure.
Isn't there a risk of overgeneralizing and ignoring the diversity within these groups?
Of course, any discussion of cultural differences has to be nuanced and avoid harmful stereotypes.
Yeah.
Sowell is very careful to emphasize that he's talking about broad cultural patterns, not individual traits.
Right.
He's not saying that every member of a particular group is the same.
Okay. It's about looking at trends and influences.
Right.
Not making judgments about individual.
Exactly. And he acknowledges that even within a given culture, there is a wide range of individual beliefs and behaviors.
Yeah.
But he argues that certain cultural values can create an environment that is either more or less conducive to economic success.
And this is where he gets really controversial, right?
Yeah.
He even challenges this idea of celebrating authenticity,
It is.
especially when it leads to clinging to values that might hold people back.
He brings up the example of black students who are accused of acting white
Right.
for speaking standard English or excelling in academics.
Yeah.
He argues that sometimes celebrating authenticity can mean clinging to values that are incompatible with success in a modern economy.
It's a tough argument to make, but I can see his point.
Yeah.
If certain cultural norms discourage academic achievement or entrepreneurial ambition, then those norms, even if well-intentioned, could actually be harmful in the long run.
He's not saying that people should abandon their culture
Right.
or assimilate into some dominant norm.
Of course not.
But he is suggesting that we need to have an honest conversation about how certain cultural values can affect economic outcomes.
Okay, so we've talked about geography, culture, and the role of government.
Yeah.
What about technology?
Right.
How does that fit into Sowell's vision of the future of wealth and poverty?
He acknowledges the transformative power of technology,
Yeah.
but he's not a techno-utopian. He argues that technology is a tool, and its impact depends on the human capital and cultural values of those using it.
So just having access to the internet or smartphones
Right.
doesn't automatically solve problems of poverty or inequality?
Right. He uses the example of early 20th century China,
Okay.
which was technologically advanced for its time,
Yeah.
but made this fateful decision to isolate itself from the West.
Right.
As a result, they fell behind for centuries.
So even with the most advanced technology, progress isn't guaranteed.
Right.
You need the right cultural foundation
Yes.
and the willingness to embrace innovation.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of Sowell's biggest concerns,
Okay.
the rise of what he calls the unconstrained vision.
What does he mean by that?
He's referring to this belief that government can and should solve all social problems.
Oh, okay.
And this leads to an ever-expanding welfare state
Right.
and a concentration of power in the hands of bureaucrats and politicians.
Okay. And he contrasts this with the constrained vision, which emphasizes individual responsibility, free markets, and a reliance on civil society rather than government intervention.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He argues that the unconstrained vision ultimately leads to a decline in individual liberty, a stifling of innovation, and slower economic growth.
He uses examples like minimum wage laws and rent control,
Right.
which often have these unintended consequences that
Yeah.
harm the very people they're meant to help.
Exactly. He's not saying that government has no role to play,
Okay.
but he believes its role should be limited
Yeah.
and focused on creating an environment where individuals and businesses can thrive,
Okay.
not trying to micromanage outcomes.
So what's his ultimate prescription for a better future?
Well, he's a strong advocate for free markets, limited government, and individual initiative.
Okay.
He believes that the best way to lift people out of poverty
Yeah.
and create widespread prosperity is to empower individuals to pursue their own goals, take risks, and reap the rewards of their efforts.
And he emphasizes the importance of education that focuses on practical skills, character development, and a strong work ethic,
Yes.
not just abstract academic knowledge.
He's also a big proponent of school choice and charter schools,
Yeah.
as he believes they give parents and students more options,
Right.
particularly those trapped in failing public schools.
And he stresses the vital role of family and community,
Yes.
arguing that strong families and vibrant civil society institutions are essential for fostering human capital
Right.
and creating a sense of belonging.
So Wells' vision is ultimately a hopeful one.
Okay.
He believes that even in a world with these complex problems and persistent disparities, we each have the power to make a difference.
I like that.
He challenges us to focus on what we can control,
Right.
our own efforts, our own values, and our own contributions to society.
So what does this all mean for our listener as they finish this deep dive?
I think the key takeaway is to be discerning consumers of information. Don't just accept easy answers or simplistic narratives about wealth and poverty.
Yeah.
Question assumptions, challenge conventional wisdom,
Right.
and be willing to consider different perspectives.
And most importantly, don't lose sight of the power of individual action.
Right.
So Wells' work is a reminder that even in the face of these daunting challenges, we're not powerless. We can make choices that empower ourselves and our communities.
We can invest in our own human capital and that of our children. We can support institutions that promote liberty and opportunity.
Yeah.
We can choose to focus on solutions rather than blame,
Right.
on progress rather than resentment.
And in doing so, we can help create a future that is more prosperous, more just, and more fulfilling for all.
That concludes our deep dive into Thomas Sowell's Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. If you're intrigued by his ideas, we highly recommend checking out the book itself. It's packed with historical examples, data, and insights that will challenge your assumptions and expand your understanding of the forces shaping our world.
And remember, this is just the beginning of your exploration.
Yeah.
Take these ideas, apply them to your own life. Continue to seek out diverse perspectives and engage in conversations. Until next time, keep learning
Keep questioning.
and keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us.
See ya.